And now to the main event here. Tonight's speaker lived and worked in China and Hong Kong for almost 2 decades, most recently in Shanghai as counsel in an American law firm of Paul Weiss, and earlier in Hong Kong as a partner in the international law firm Baker and McKinsey. He's a columnist in Newsweek and writes regularly for The Hill, is also a senior fellow at the Gatestone Institute for International Policy. Gordon's writing on China and North Korea have appeared, amongst other places, in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the American Conservative, and Barron's. He's the author of numerous books, including Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World, and The Coming Collapse of China. In addition to addressing many of the most prestigious institutions around the country and the world, he's given briefings at the National Intelligence Agency, the CIA, the State Department, the Pentagon, and has appeared before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. You may have seen Gordon on one of his appearances on major news channels, including this very afternoon on Neil Cavuto. My favorite place to find Gordon is where I've been listening to his insights for many years on the John Batchelor radio show. I encourage you strongly to find him there. All this puts him in a singularly good position to answer tonight's ultimate question. Why are we funding a hostile regime in China that labels the US as its enemy? Please join me in welcoming Gordon G. Chang.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you to the forum. Thank you for everyone to participate here, either online or in person. Patriots, we have got to save our country. This is a moment of peril like we have never seen. But you and you and you are going to stand up, and we are going to save the United States of America. We start with a question. What does the People's Republic of China want? A few moments ago, Jolene in the audience stopped me and said, I know what China wants. It wants to rule the world. Jolene, you're absolutely right. Thank you so much. The Chinese regime wants to take away our sovereignty and rule the world. It also wants to rule the near parts of the solar system. And yes, I know that does sound ludicrous, but no, I'm not exaggerating. We start with planet Earth. Chinese ruler Xi Jinping is trying to end the Westphalian International Order. In his landmark speech on July 1, marking the centennial of the founding of China's ruling party, he said this, quote, the Communist Party of China and the Chinese people, with their bravery and tenacity, solemnly proclaim to the world that the Chinese people are not only good in taking down the old world, but also good in building a new one. These words mean that China wants to go back to the imperial era system where emperors believed that they not only had the mandate of heaven over Tianxia, all under heaven, but they also were compelled by heaven to do so. Now, Xi Jinping has been using Tianxia language for 2 decades now, but recently his pronouncements have become unmistakable. In his 2017 New Year's message, for instance, he wrote this, quote, the Chinese people have always held that the world is united and all under heaven. And there's that phrase, all under heaven. All under heaven are one family. And if that weren't explicit enough, his foreign minister, Wang Yi, wrote an article in Study Times, which is the Central Party School's newspaper, in September 2017. And in that article, Wang Yi wrote that Xi Jinping thought, and a thought in Communist Party lingo is an important ideological body of work, Wang Yi wrote that Xi Jinping thought made innovations on and transcended traditional Western theories of international relations of the past 300 years. Take 2017, subtract 300 years, and you almost get to 1648. And that means Wang Yi, with his time reference, was pointing to the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, which established the current system of sovereign states. So when Wang Yi wrote that Xi Jinping has transcended this system, what he's really saying is that Xi Jinping doesn't want sovereign states or no more of them than China. And this tells us that Xi is not competing with the US. So many people, including Biden, say, oh, China's just a competitor. No, they are not competing with us in the international system. They're not even trying to adjust that system. What they're trying to do is to overthrow it altogether, which means that China, once again, is ruled by a revolutionary. With regard to the solar system, since about 2018, Chinese officials have been talking about how the moon and Mars are sovereign Chinese territory. That's right, a part of the People's Republic of China. And that means they consider it to be theirs and theirs alone, like the South China Sea. It also means that they believe that they will exclude others from going to the moon and Mars if they get there first. And we don't have to speculate about that because that's what Chinese officials in public have explicitly talked about. Go back to April, when Beijing publicly announced the name of its Mars rover. And the Chinese said, oh, this rover, we're calling it Zhurong because Zhurong is the god of fire. This is Mars. Okay. What Beijing didn't say is that Zhurong is also a god of war and the god of the South China Sea. So now we know what China wants. Question is, let's talk about their tactics. And tonight we'll talk about three tactics: disease, subversion, and fentanyl. First, disease. Where did COVID-19 come from? Well, on August 27th, Biden announced or released a summary, an unclassified summary of the report of the intelligence community, which looked at the issue of the origin. And the IC, as it's called, said, well, there are two possibilities. One, it was a natural mutation from a bat to a human. The other, a lab leak. They said both theories are plausible, but they didn't really say which one was more likely. We do not need to have 100% assurance. Biden has now has enough information in order to impose severe costs on China. And that's because, as the summary said, China was trying to hinder the global community as it was investigating the issue of origin. It was resisting calls for producing information, and it was just blaming everybody else, especially the United States. Now, there's no justification for China's actions. It has the information about where this disease comes from. It's not sharing it, and it's trying to prevent and hide this issue. So we have to impose those costs because it has that because Beijing has that obligation and is failing to do it. Now, there are two other reasons, each one of them sufficient on its own, why we need to impose these costs on Beijing. First one, even if COVID-19 did not start out life as a biological weapon, China turned it into one. Most critically, the Chinese officials knew for at least 5 weeks, and if you believe a Harvard Medical School study, maybe they knew for 5 months, but for at least 5 weeks, they knew that this disease was highly transmissible from one human to the next. But they lied. They lied. They told the international community, don't worry about COVID-19. It is not contagious. At the same time, while Xi Jinping was locking down Wuhan and surrounding cities, I know lockdowns are controversial, but by locking down Wuhan, the Chinese leader was saying in his own mind, I think this is an effective way to stop the disease. So while this guy was locking down Wuhan and surrounding cities, he was pressuring other countries not to impose travel restrictions and quarantines on arrivals from China. And it were those arrivals from China that spread this disease to the world. A disease that should have been contained in the central part of China became a global pandemic. 4.5 million people outside China killed, including 664,000 Americans as of today. So, this is the first time in history that one nation has attacked all others. We do not know what Xi Jinping was actually thinking, but if after having seen what this disease did to cripple China, if he wanted to level the playing field by spreading this disease elsewhere, he would have done exactly what he did. Is China really that malicious? Well, the Chinese use this concept called comprehensive national power. They borrowed it from the Soviets. It's a series of metrics to measure the strength of a country. And China, of course, wants to be number one. Yeah, every country does. But there's two ways to get to number one. One of them is you strengthen your own country. That's fair game. Every country should try to do that. But the other way is to weaken everybody else. And that's exactly what China did. It used disease to weaken the rest of the world. Now, the other reason why we should impose costs is that China is working on a new generation of biological weapons. The 2017 edition of the Science of Military Strategy, which is published by China's National Defense University, actually has an article which talks about a new form of biological warfare of, quote, specific ethnic genetic attacks. In other words, they're talking about pathogens that will leave the Chinese immune, but sicken and kill everybody else. And by the way, Bill Gertz has written extensively about these types of pathogens. So that means that the next virus, microbe, or bug from China could be the civilization killer, leaving China as the world's only viable society. So yes, we need to penalize China for compensation, for justice, whatever you call it. But more important than justice and compensation, we need to establish deterrence. After all, Xi Jinping right now realizes that he's just spread a disease, killed 4.5 million people, and has borne no cost for that. That means that he will feel that with impunity, he can spread the next disease and kill off the rest of the world. Second tactic, talk about subversion. Beijing has tried to surreptitiously cause problems in the United States with its troll and other operations. And Beijing's operations dwarf Russia's. So for instance, June of last year, Twitter takes down 174,000 fake Chinese accounts. That's one social media platform, 1 month, 174,000 accounts. These big Chinese networks try to do a number of things. Last year, for instance, they tried to defeat President Trump. This year, they're spreading critical race theory, among other things. TikTok, the wildly popular mobile video sharing app from China, is now glorifying drug use in the US, a form of warfare. So let's talk about TikTok, which as of this March has a new CEO who is closely tied to the Chinese regime. TikTok has a sister site in China called Douyin. Now, Douyin's engineers actually are the ones who are responsible for working on the algorithms of TikTok. In other words, those algorithms that, among other things, curate videos. In other words, determine which videos your kids see. And that gives Beijing the ability to boost the signal. In other words, to get people to do what they want. And in this connection, we should ask, why did China choose to close the Chinese, why did Secretary Pompeo State Department, why did he try to close the Houston consulate of China last July instead of one of the other four? Well, state says China was using Houston as a hub for espionage. Well, China uses all of its consulates for that purpose. I think that the State Department closed Houston because China was using that as a base to provide logistical and other support for violent protesters in the United States. A Radio Free Asia report says that China put Chinese military officers from their intelligence unit into the Houston consulate. And from there, they used big data and artificial intelligence to identify Americans likely to participate in Black Lives Matter and Antifa protests. And then they sent those Americans videos via TikTok on how to organize riots. This is more than just subversion. This is an act of war. What we're also seeing right now is that China is using these networks to promote protests in the United States against what they call anti-Asian hate. Now, Google and Mandiant, which have identified these campaigns on the part of China, say, well, these campaigns weren't successful. But as an Asian American, I can tell you, I think they were extremely successful. But the Chinese have gone beyond this whole notion of just mere incitement, and they have started to organize protests from what we can tell. So on the night of May 31st of last year, I believe that China actually put protesters on the street of Washington, 1 block north of the White House. That was the night, if you'll remember, that St. John's Church was torched. That night, protesters, a number of them were speaking Mandarin. They were acting in organized fashion. And some of them were actually overheard saying things that suggested that the Chinese embassy actually organized them to protest. Now, these reports are unconfirmed, but they do mirror stories of Chinese protesters in Los Angeles and other Southern California locations. And there are other suspicious reports. So for instance, last January, agents of the US Customs and Border Protection in the International Falls Port of Entry in Minnesota seized 900,000 counterfeit $1 bills from China. In China's near total surveillance state, nobody can counterfeit American currency without the Communist Party and the central government knowing about it. And so the question is, what was Beijing doing here? Well, we don't know, but this was just a few months before the George Floyd protests in that state of Minnesota. And perhaps what Beijing was doing was trying to support protesters with $1 bills. I don't know, but nobody counterfeits $1 bills for profit. There had to have been some other motive here. But whatever the motive, counterfeiting another country's currency is an act of war. Also, a few months later, in May, Customs and Border Protection seizes automatic weapons parts from China. Third is fentanyl. Fentanyl is one of dozens of opioids made in China. It is intended to poison people, often kills them. It's made in laboratories in China. It's smuggled into the United States, sometimes through the US mail, but increasingly through our southern border. Right now, with border protection agents completely overwhelmed by the flood of people, there's now been a flood of fentanyl. Fentanyl is coming into our country through the southern border in record quantities. Also, fentanyl comes into our country from our northern border because the Chinese fentanyl gangs have established themselves in Canada, especially in Vancouver. Now, in China's near total surveillance state, the state knows what's going on because fentanyl gangs are not small. They are large, they are international, they are visible to the Chinese state. And so we have to believe that fentanyl gangs in China have Beijing's blessing. And many people think that the Ministry of State Security not only knows about fentanyl, of course, they approve of it and maybe even profiting from it. Last year, we don't have firm numbers, but there are about 53,000 Americans who died from fentanyl overdose. That's dying from fentanyl directly, but increasingly fentanyl mixed with methamphetamines and cocaine. Every one of those deaths, 53,000 or not, every one of those deaths should be considered a murder. Now that we know what the People's Republic of China wants, and now we know that what it's doing, issue is, can we get along with China? Last September, Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the UN, gave a speech in which he said the world, quote, must avoid a new Cold War. We are, he said, headed in a, quote, very dangerous direction. We can all agree with this dangerous direction assessment, but we might not agree with his proposed solution. His proposed solution was multilateral cooperation. Now, Guterres was speaking at an event marking the 75th anniversary of the founding of the UN, and it was a rather somber affair because multilateralism, the core ideology of the UN, is failing. Countries are bypassing that organization because they know it cannot provide security. So, of course, they're defending themselves. Much the same thing happened in the 1930s with the predecessor of the UN, the League of Nations. At that time, countries realized it was ineffective, that the League was not able to deal with the aggressors of that time. Imperial Japan, fascist Italy, Nazi Germany. Today, we're trying to cooperate with China. This is a policy Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives have endorsed. Go back to the administration of George W. Bush, 2005, that famous speech by Robert Zoellick, who was then Deputy Secretary of State, who said that they wanted China to be a quote unquote responsible stakeholder in the international system. Well, unfortunately, China rejects that. They reject it all the time, most notably at the end of July when they said, well, the US notion of international order is nothing more than, quote, the rule of the jungle. We shouldn't be surprised by China's rejection. As political scientist, California, by the way, Min Chin Pei says, a illiberal political system and a constructive foreign policy do not mix. We know they don't mix because the Communist Party idealizes struggle, and that makes its leaders insecure. Even worse than that, from an American perspective, we know that the Communist Party believes that it is in an existential struggle with the United States because they realize, this has nothing to do with us folks, they realize that because America has an inspirational impact on the Chinese people because of our values, that communism can't survive in a world where the United States of America exists. And that's something that our leaders have yet to understand. So it's not about us. And that's why Biden, he wants to have nice relations with those guys in Beijing. So he sent his Secretary of State and his National Security Advisor to Anchorage to meet China's top two diplomats. That didn't work out. That was the middle of March. End of July, he sends Wendy Sherman, the current Deputy Secretary of State, to Tianjin. That didn't work out either. China timed massive disinformation campaigns, inflammatory campaigns around these two visits. It also didn't work last Thursday. Last Thursday, Biden had a 90-minute phone call with Xi Jinping, his second long conversation with him. And the Chinese then issued a lot of propaganda the moment that Biden put down the receiver, saying, oh, the United States requested this call, which means that we Chinese have the upper hand. And we have the upper hand because Biden realizes that he needs China's cooperation. So China doesn't want dialogue. In tension with a communist Beijing, is inevitable. It's not about us. It's about the nature of the Chinese political system. So what do we do? I got an action plan. I got an action plan because, as I mentioned, our republic is in peril and we do not have a moment to lose. And there's a common theme that I have, that we need to sever relations with China. We need to sever relations with China for a number of reasons, and I know this sounds drastic, but the problem is that China uses every point of contact with our society to destroy the American Republic. And we are being overwhelmed. FBI is overwhelmed, local law enforcement's overwhelmed, governments and private institutions are overwhelmed. And we have to understand that we have to cut our contacts until we can be sure that we can manage this unrelenting assault. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we are not managing it now. China's regime is dangerous, and there's very little that we can do as long as we maintain these contacts. Now, an American president has all the tools that he needs. He can employ the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, and if he's really feeling bold one morning, he can actually apply the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. China's regime is not reformable, so it is dangerous. So I've got an action plan, 7 items, plus 3 more. First one, we should cut our trade links with China. We should not be enriching a hostile state with our trade. This means, among other things, getting our factories off of Chinese soil, especially our pharmaceutical industry. Now, President Trump started this process at the end of last year when he actually sponsored a $765 million loan for Eastman Kodak to make active pharmaceutical agreements. Now, yes, this is industrial policy, and I don't like industrial policy. And yes, President Trump's effort misfired, but we've got to do this. One way or another, we have got to do this. We cannot rely on a hostile regime that calls us an enemy for something as important as drugs. China's leadership, they say, look, US-China decoupling. Decoupling is the word they use. US-China decoupling is not possible. Well, we've got to make it inevitable. Second thing, we have to cut investment into China. President Trump banned investment into military-linked companies. That's a great start, but we've got to go further. We've got to make sure that state pension money doesn't go into Chinese companies and get American portfolio investors out of there. The reason we need to do this is that we Americans may think that there are civilian companies and military companies, but not in China. In China, they got a doctrine of civil-military fusion, which means that everything a civilian institution has is directly pipelined into the Chinese military if the generals and admirals want it. So we should not be enriching a hostile state with our investment dollars. Third thing, we should eject China's agents from our countries. Secretary Pompeo did a great thing in July when he closed the Houston consulate, but China has 4 more. Let's close them down as well. And that embassy in Washington with thousands of people, well, we should cut that down to just the ambassador and his family. I also believe that we need to turf out their businesses, especially their state banks, because their employees also are agents. Fourth, we need to get China to stop systematically using its nationals to commit espionage against the United States. Almost every quote unquote Chinese journalist in the US from China, they're intelligence agents. And let's remember that China's 2017 national intelligence law requires every Chinese national to spy on the US if demanded. That's every Chinese national. This is our country. We do not have to put up with this. So Americans, Let's get these guys out of our country. Fifth thing, we should demand reciprocity. If China doesn't allow our media into China, then why do we allow Chinese media in our country? If China doesn't allow our apps in China, then why do we permit TikTok and other Chinese apps here? And if we can't have a Reagan Institute in China, then why do they have Confucius Institutes on our college and university campuses? And what's even worse, they have 500 Confucius classrooms in our secondary schools. 6, we need to end all technical cooperation agreements with China. We give them the world's best technology almost for nothing, sometimes for nothing. Sometimes we pay them to actually develop technology. So for instance, we are continuing to fund research at military-linked institutions in China on coronavirus. And in fact, for more than a decade, we have been funding gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Thank you, Dr. Fauci. No more. 7th thing, we should not allow China to buy our tech companies. In 2013, we actually allowed China to buy a company which had the largest collection of DNA profiles of Americans. That's Complete Genomics. That is a complete failure on our part to understand China. So 7 things. In addition, there are 3 things that we can do. So first of all, we can call up our broker and say, sell Chinese stocks, and sell, this is more important, sell mutual funds that include Chinese stocks. Second, look before you shop. If you can, don't buy stuff from China. Third, demand that websites like Amazon include cool information. That's COOL, country of origin labeling. We should make this a law. Senate Bill 1260, the United States Innovation and Competition Act, includes country of origin rules, thanks to Rick Scott, the senator from Florida. This bill is now sitting in the House. I hope it becomes law. We should not be supporting China's attacks on us with our everyday purchasing decisions. Now, these 10 things, they're not easy. They are going to require political will. They're going to require educating the American public. Thank you, Jane. They are going to require grassroots organizing. They're going to require electing candidates who will unswervingly oppose China's regime. Yeah, this is going to be hard. But if we don't do this, what are our children going to think when they realize that we had the means to protect them and we decided not to do so? So it's time to take back our country. This moment is consequential. This moment is our Lexington and Concord. America is worth fighting for. And with all of you guys in the fight, I am sure we will prevail. Thank you very much.
To get us started, what percentage of anti-American kind of spirit that we have here right now do you think is triggered and funded and sponsored by the CCP? And are they sowing those same seeds of self-hatred in South Korea?
Well, they certainly are in our country because we know what they've been doing supporting critical race theory. Also, as I mentioned, they are trying to promote these protests. They try to sort of equate this to say, well, you know, all of these campaigns against what China is doing, it's just triggering hatred of Asian Americans in the US, so you shouldn't be doing it. So all of this is actually, I think, a lot of this we know because from its open propaganda, what they say in People's Daily, Xinhua News Agency, Global Times, but also through their troll operations, which they try to do surreptitiously. So they do use social media for a lot of these campaigns. And it does have an effect because we see that, for instance, last year, why did we have all of these protests throughout the United States? Why all of a sudden? I mean, there can be a number of reasons for it, but I think one of them is that they were fueled by social media from China. And the one thing that is striking is that China is now starting to, it feels so bold that it can actually come out of the shadows. So for instance, October 18th of last year, Chen Weihua, who is the China Daily European bureau chief, actually on Twitter urged Americans to throw petrol bombs on American streets. I mean, that's an act of war. And by the way, Chen was not deplatformed. But the point is, Beijing now feels bold enough to do openly what it once did surreptitiously. So it shows a state of mind of China that they think that they can do whatever they want.
Would you comment on Michael Pillsbury's work, The 100 Years Marathon?
Yeah, Michael Pillsbury wrote a great book, and I commend everyone to read it. There is this notion, and it's true, that China has a long-term plan to destroy the United States. And sometimes they're open about it in Beijing, as they are now. Sometimes they're covert and they don't actually say what they want to do, but they do have a multi-decade, let's say 100-year plan. But sometimes though, we have seen recently the China, you hear this a lot, that Chinese are long-term thinkers. They think in centuries, we think in calendar quarters. I'm sure that you've heard that. But recently, Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, has been thinking very short term. And for instance, we see this in Hong Kong. And let me just give you an example, because I think this illustrates the nature of Chinese boldness and also how, for various reasons, they aren't thinking strategically. So for instance, China promised Hong Kong 50 years of a high degree of autonomy. They did that in the 1984 Joint Declaration. They took it back in 1997. 50 years expires in 2047. If they do nothing, everyone will say, oh, it's great. China honored its promises. And they get back Hong Kong in 2047 and they can do what they want. What they did was they started to try to take the place over in violation of their promises of autonomy. And we especially saw this last year with their June 30 national security law. What has happened is that, yes, they've been able to control Hong Kong, but they lost a bigger prize, which is Taiwan. Because this one country, two systems formula, which is meant for Hong Kong, was actually developed for Taiwan. And once China actually started to violate its promises on Hong Kong, the people in Taiwan said, whoa, there is no way that we're going to accommodate China. If you go back to 2019, this gets a little wonky, but it does illustrate how short-sighted China is. Go back to 2019, Tsai Ing-wen, who was the president of Taiwan, who's the Green Party, essentially the pro-independence party. Beijing hates her. And she was so unpopular, she was not going to get the nomination of her own party to run for re-election. But after the people in Taiwan saw what was happening in Hong Kong, the people in Taiwan, first of all, the Democratic Progressive Party, they gave her the nomination to run for president again. And President Tsai actually won in a landslide, beating China's candidate. So what they really want is Taiwan. They're not going to get it because of what they were doing in Hong Kong. It's really short-sighted. So yes, the Chinese do think 100-year marathons, but recently we've seen that they are excessively short-term thinkers.
Okay. We're going to take a couple of questions now from our internet audience.
Yeah, these come from Zoomland. That's out there to do there. There's two, actually. One question that just came across was specifically, very good timing, is Taiwan gone? And so I'd like to comment that perhaps not, or would you like to speak further on that? Or
yeah. Okay, for folks in Zoomland and everybody else, Taiwan is not gone. Taiwan very much is healthy, robust, is absolutely determined to defend itself. Really, this is one of the great stories of the last 2 or 3 years. Policies that President Trump emphasized in his last year in office and have been continued through the Biden administration shows American strong support for Taiwan. And in fact, you know, the first thing that happened after the fall of Kabul was Beijing propaganda said to the people of Taiwan, the US won't defend you. You know, when we invade, and they use like when we invade Taiwan, Americans will bug out. People in Taiwan, you know, they looked at this and they said, we're not focusing on the debacle in Kabul. We're focusing on long-term US commitment to Taiwan. And that's a good thing because these people are determined to defend themselves. Look, they think in Taiwan, we tend to think of them as Chinese. The Chinese think of them as Chinese. No, people in Taiwan view themselves as Taiwanese, not Chinese. When you look at self-identification surveys in Taiwan, they consistently say somewhere between 2/3 and 80% of people on the island view themselves as Taiwanese only. That number is up substantially over the last 10 years. The number of people in Taiwan who view themselves as Chinese only is now under 3% in the last survey. So this is a society that's going to defend itself because we know that culture is more important than anything else. That's clearly evident in, for instance, the voting patterns of the United States. Culture trumps everything. And that means the people in Taiwan are going to defend themselves. And I actually think that there's a consensus in Washington across both political parties to defend Taiwan. And the reason is Taiwan is absolutely critical to the defense of the US. It sits in the middle of what the Chinese call the first island chain, which prevents the Chinese Navy and Air Force from surging into the Western Pacific, where we don't want them. But more important, Taiwan's a vibrant democracy. And China is attacking not just our democracy, it's attacking democracies in general. So we can't allow the Chinese to take over any democracy, especially one as important as Taiwan. Of course, none of us know the future, but Taiwan looks like it's going to be okay.
We'll do one more from Zoom land, then Jane will switch over to our live audience. Something that pops up a lot and then kind of fades away is cybersecurity and attacks and cyber attacks from China. Could you speak to that?
China is the world's #1 cyber attacker. As a side note, when we think of North Korean cyber attackers, we should view that as Chinese because North Korea's cyber warriors are actually based in China. The attack on Sony Pictures Entertainment, that was launched from Chinese IP addresses. And this is a question that is not just that the North Koreans and the Chinese are villains. This is a question of American presidents not defending US networks. Sony was the end of 2014, Obama administration. When the FBI was asked a question, was any country other than North Korea involved in the attack on Sony? The FBI said, no, that was wrong. We have seen, and it's not just Obama, George W. Bush was even a bigger offender. These presidents, Obama, Bush, they did not, they knew about China cyber attacking us. Sorry, I'm getting emotional, but they knew that China was cyber attacking us and they deliberately chose for various reasons not to defend us. And that's why we Americans have got to stand up for ourselves because we've got a political class today that is not defending us. We have the vote. You guys voted today. We got another election coming in November for school boards, absolutely critical. I've never voted in a school board election. I will this November. November after that, midterms. November after that, 2024. Absolutely critical for the survival of the United States. We can do this, and we're going to have to do this because we've got political leaders, we got Wall Street, we got Walmart. They've sold out. We've got to defend ourselves. Oh, sorry, I didn't answer the question. China has been cyber attacking, of course, and they do this for any number of different reasons. We hack them, they hack us, but when we hack them, we're only going after government networks. espionage against another government is considered fair game. What China is doing is going after American corporates for commercial information, which they use against American companies. They also go after newspapers, NGOs, and other targets that are not considered fair game. And to the credit of the Biden administration, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, they actually identified that Chinese ransomware attacks, criminals, are actually the Ministry of State Security working with individual Chinese hackers. So this is state ransomware attacks. So what did the Biden administration do after it said that China was involved in criminal activity? Because this was right after the Microsoft Exchange hack. Well, we had the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies tell the Aspen Security Forum, yeah, China committed a crime against us, but we're not doing anything about it. And when asked, why aren't you doing anything about it? She said, well, you know, we talked to our European allies and they don't want to impose any costs on China. Well, hello, this is our law and we do not need the approval of somebody in Rome or Bonn or whatever to say about enforcement of our own laws. This is wrong. Now, I understand Biden when he says, look, we need the help of our allies in confronting China. It's better to do it with a coalition. Yes. But the problem is that you end up with lowest common denominator solutions. And sometimes, as in this case, a hack against Microsoft, there are no solutions. This is wrong, ladies and gentlemen. And so again, yeah, there's a question, the Chinese are villains, but we have a political class that has allowed them to do this. And I just say, no more.
Gordon, I'm going to combine a couple of questions here because I think they're kind of political/cultural. One of our audience members says, for so many years, Western strategists told us that as China grew more economically successful, that it would have evolved towards greater freedom. How did we get it so wrong? And also, how did we allow China to take over our manufacturing so you could only buy things made in China? Who's responsible for that?
Okay, the two questions. First one. Both political parties have bought into this notion of engagement, which is, as you say, as the Chinese grow stronger, they'll grow benign. This was a failure to understand communism. It is true that authoritarian governments, including those in Asia, which became stronger, did become benign. Taiwan, for instance, started out as a totalitarian dictatorship after Chiang Kai-shek lost the Chinese Civil War, ran one of the most miserable regimes on earth. Ended up a vibrant democracy. And we've seen the same things in South Korea and even to a lesser extent in Japan. These weren't communist states. We Americans have fundamentally misunderstood and do not understand even today the nature of communism. And so this is really our fault. In terms of our manufacturing going to Asia and going to China specifically, I think this was because during the Clinton administration, there was this notion, yeah, China will not survive prosperity. And that's a really complex question. But the point is that, at least for the moment, it is surviving prosperity and it's using prosperity to strengthen itself to harm not only the United States, but others. And of course, the most immediate victims of this are the Chinese people themselves. What happened is that we lowered the barriers to trade. During the Cold War, there were political barriers to trade. And that's why we didn't strengthen the Soviet Union. But because of what people saw as the end of the Cold War, remember, end of history, as political scientist Francis Fukuyama said. In 1990s, as Henry Kissinger said, we took a holiday from history. History continued. But we felt, oh, we can locate our manufacturing in cheap places like China, and everyone can make a lot of money. The problem is that Wall Street made money, corporates made money, but Americans lost their jobs. And when someone from Walmart, and they make this argument all the time, oh, you know, we're lowering the cost of goods so that Americans can live better, that's only certain Americans, because many Americans have lost their livelihoods. And one of the reasons why we have a fentanyl crisis in our country is because people have lost hope. There is despair. They don't have a job. You can go through some of these communities and you can see what's happened as manufacturing has left the United States. The good news here is that for many reasons, Xi Jinping, Chinese ruler, doesn't like foreign business. China's becoming too expensive, all sorts of reasons. Manufacturing is starting to migrate out of China to places like Vietnam, and even some of it's coming back to the US. Really complicated story, but this is something that we should encourage. We should put up the political barriers to change. Oh, by the way, I'm in California, right? California, climate change. If you're serious about climate change, what you want to do is you want to get those factories out of China where all the electricity is produced by coal, and you want it over here. As is often said, the 15 largest container ships, those are the ones that cross the Pacific, by the way, and are now stacked up at Long Beach. The 15 largest container ships produce more carbon than all of the cars in the world. If we start making our stuff on this side of the Pacific, thank you. If we start making our stuff on this side of the Pacific, cleaner air. One other thing, we got a crisis at our southern border. We got a crisis at our southern border because the Northern Triangle countries, they've been devastated, like the United States has been, by China's accession to the World Trade Organization at the end of 2001. So those societies have no hope. That's why you have the migrants are not coming from Mexico, by and large. They're coming from Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador. If those factories were to go back to the Northern Triangle, those societies would be stabilized. We do not have a southern border problem. Now, I would like those factories back in the US, but some of those factories might not come here. I'd like to have them not in China, not in Vietnam, not in India. I'd like to see them in Central America so that we have a stable border.
Gordon, there are a couple of questions about the way that the U.S. Left Afghanistan and how it affected our relationship with China. So what does this mean to the Indian people and to the American people in terms of our future?
India is the country that could very well be the most affected by the debacle in Kabul because of the way we left. When we left a lot of intelligence about, who was helping us. But we also left intelligence about who was helping India. And India was a main supporter of the Afghan government. People in India now are very concerned that with the Taliban in control in Afghanistan, Pakistan will feel emboldened to launch even more terrorist attacks against India. I mean, Pakistan doesn't need encouragement to do that. But now it probably feels that it has a stable border with Afghanistan and can do what it wants in Kashmir and in other parts of India. The reason why this is such a debacle for the US is that prior to the fall of Kabul, India was working very closely with America. There's something called the Quad. It's India, Japan, Australia, the US. It was actually sort of like NATO, not formalized, but was actually working more closely than the NATO countries were working. This was a really good story for the US. After the fall of Kabul, Indian policymakers are now saying, who are these Americans? We can't trust them. And America-friendly Indian policymakers have now gone quiet. And the ones who are determining policy are the Russian-friendly Indian policymakers. And we could see India more closely aligned with Russia. During the Cold War, Russia and India were very close. We could see that happening again. We could lose the world's most populous democracy, which very well could be the world's most populous state now. Don't get me started on demography. It's one of my favorite topics. You'll never go home. So we're not talking about that. But the point is, we cannot afford to lose India, and we are losing India right now because of this.
I'm going to combine a couple of questions too, staying with the international flavor. One question was, what about our other traditional allies? Can they help us with Hong Kong and Taiwan specifically, and how about Japan? How does Japan fit into all this?
Yeah. With regard to Hong Kong, many people say, oh, it's lost, there's nothing we can do. Well, yeah, there's a lot we can do. We can get our banks and companies out of Hong Kong. And that's important because if Hong Kong remains a thriving financial center, China will say its policy worked. More important, China will feel secure enough so it will then put up the pressure on Taiwan and the United States. So let's deal with the Chinese in Hong Kong rather than in Hawaii, for instance. This is indeed a complicated question. There's a lot we can do in terms of offering, for instance, refuge to Hong Kong people. We could make life difficult for the Chinese in Hong Kong. I mean, as we've done in a number of other countries. But we've got to go back to the understanding that China is a mortal enemy. And so we should not let them have any advantage, make them fight for everything that they got. With regard to Taiwan, we talked a little bit about that earlier. I think the point there, though, is that we're seeing NATO countries start to realize that they have a stake in the South China Sea and East China Sea. So for instance, right now, there's a German destroyer in the South China Sea. There is also the Queen Elizabeth, which is Britain's only aircraft carrier. That's there as well. There's a Dutch ship that was there about a month ago. So Europe is understanding that it's important to protect those vital waterways. And of course, Japan, up until a few minutes ago, it was India and Australia, are also much more actively involved in protecting freedom of navigation and the global commons in the South China Sea and East China Sea. So that's a good story. It's not just us anymore. But it's got to be a lot of countries working, because now's a time, because of the fall of Kabul, it reinforced in the minds of Chinese policymakers that the United States is in terminal decline and that Beijing, that they can do whatever they want. And that was the tone of their propaganda after the fall of Kabul. But I actually think that was reflective of what they were actually thinking. So we need to reestablish deterrence. Now, on August 27th, a significant event occurred. We sent an Arleigh Burke destroyer and a Coast Guard cutter through Taiwan Strait as a message to China. We're going to have to do a lot more of that. We're going to have to do it in conjunction with Britain and with all the other countries that believe that they've got a stake in this. So there's a room for us to work. It's going to take at least a decade for us to recover from Kabul. It took a long time for us to recover from Vietnam, but we did that through various reasons. We can recover now, and we're going to absolutely have to, because we can see that China right now thinks that it can do what it wants. One other thing, we didn't get a chance to talk about it, but China's going through and is basically on the edge of a great debt crisis. There's a property developer, the second largest in China, called Evergrande. It owes $300 billion. It's going to default on September 21. If it fails, it would take down the property sector, which is a major part of the Chinese economy, take down the financial system, take down the Chinese economy, probably take down the Chinese political system. So Beijing's not going to let this happen. But Beijing's going to have a hard time with Evergrande. The reason I mention this is that Chinese leaders right now realize they've got a closing window of opportunity. They've got real problems at home. And one of the ways that they can defend their regime is creating problems abroad. If they don't want the Chinese people to think about Evergrande, maybe they want the Chinese people to think about Taiwan or whatever. So this is an extraordinarily perilous time. And the problem is that we got a political class, both Republicans and Democrats for that matter, that I think don't understand the gravity of this particular moment in history.
Gordon, I'm going to combine again a number of questions because you're talking about internal frailties. So the question is how will China's impending population problems affect its plan for world domination, as well as their responses to the flooding and other natural disasters. Now that their people are angry and informed, and I'm going to combine that with several people who want to know the relevance of your book, "The Coming Collapse of China," because do you still believe that that's true?
Somebody asked me about demography, so you guys are going to regret it. After China's 7th national census, which was at the end of last year, China's now reported 1.41 billion people, and it claims a total fertility rate of 1.3. That's the average number of children per female of childbearing age. 2.1 is replacement. China probably has a replacement rate of actually more than that because of child mortality. But anyway, they're well below replacement. And they're probably not at 1.3. They're probably at something like 0.9 or maybe 1.0 if they're lucky. The reason why this is important is once you do the arithmetic, it means that at the end of the century, China, which is now more than 4 times populous in the US, could have about the same number of people as us. They could lose somewhere between 800 and 900 million people between now and the turn of the century. Now, if you're China, and I come from a Chinese household, and I know that we take great pride in being the world's biggest tribe. At the turn of the century, China may not even be in, might be in the top 10 most populous countries in the world. This is the biggest decline in demography in history in the absence of war or disease. And so this means there's a closing window of opportunity for China. And that means that, we have a lot of smart people in Washington who think that, they're reconfiguring the US military to defend ourselves against China. And they say, oh, we're planning for conflict in 2030 or 2040. No, this is the time of concern because Chinese leaders know that they've got only so much time in which they can continue to intimidate the rest of us. And intimidation really is a major part of Chinese diplomacy these days. So, okay, you got a demography problem, which I will stop talking about with great reluctance. They got a food crisis. They can't feed themselves. 2020 was a disastrous year for Chinese food self-sufficiency. 2021 is even worse because of the flooding in the central parts of the country, because of COVID-19 lockdowns, because of structural factors in China's development trajectory. So this really means that as we look forward, China will be even less able to feed itself. And Chinese leaders now have got this, they announced this last August, this Clean Your Plate campaign, which means it's really difficult to think that there's any other explanation that China realizes it's got a critical food shortage. So, and this, by the way, came from Xi Jinping himself, with particular orders to Chinese cadres how many dishes they could order at dinner. So they're serious about this. And that's the reason why I think they bought Smithfield, the American pork producer, and the reason why they're buying land in large tracts in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and elsewhere through the United States, as well as buying large tracts of farmland in Africa. So this is another reason why they feel they've got a problem. They've got an economy which is in general not growing, and you can have an economy which is not growing like ours if you don't have that much debt. But if you're China, which has just exploded its debt across government debt, private debt, corporate debt, you need to have fast growth to pay off this debt, which is Evergrande's problem. So you have an economy which is stumbling right now. I don't think it's growing. I could be wrong. But the point is, they've got problems. They got an environment which is near point of exhaustion. I wrote a book called The Coming Collapse of China in 2001, in which I made the stupid prediction that the Communist Party wouldn't last for more than a decade. I didn't foresee a lot of things, obviously, including the 2008 downturn. But the point is, China right now is facing critical vulnerabilities, later than I thought, but nonetheless, it has to deal with these. In 2008, China's regime was able to strengthen itself for a number of reasons. But what they did was they didn't avoid a debt crisis, they merely postponed it. And what's happening in China right now is they're having their 2008. And they're having their 2008 while they're also suffering these other problems. So I should be hesitant about making predictions about China's trajectory, as everyone reminds me. But the point is, China right now is at one of those very crucial moments, both internally and externally. And that's why Jolene is right. They want to rule the world because they need an out.
Gordon,
Excuse me?
How did China get in such debt?
How did China get in such debt? Great question. But they figured that the laws of economics no longer applied because they're Chinese. So they went out and borrowed a lot of money. Now, China runs a country with a very tight currency wall. The Chinese renminbi is not convertible on the capital account. In other words, that means you can't take the money out of the country without getting prior approval. When you run strict currency walls, you can do a lot of bad economics and you can continue for a very long time because people can't take their money out. Well, they can take their money out, but it's hard. So really what's going on is China's past 2008, past 2018, they've continued really wasteful policies. And because they've continued these wasteful policies, it was going to catch up with them sometime. And that sometime, I could be wrong. I've been wrong in the past, but that sometime could be now or pretty soon. You know, a lot of smart people say, it doesn't matter, China owes the money to itself, no problem. That's wrong. If you're Argentina and you owe money to foreign countries, no big deal. Because when you get into a problem, you send your finance minister who wears very expensive suits, you send him up to New York, you negotiate with the banks agree to take less, and you come back a hero because you made the foreigners pay. China can't do that because most of their debt is internal, which means when they adjust their debt, and they've got to do that, they're going to be internal political losers, unlike Argentina. Argentina, only the foreigners lost. In China, domestic parties are going to lose, which means the reason why China has taken so long to try to deal with its debt, because it's been able to postpone it, plus it's politically very, very difficult to make people lose money internally.
okay. Well, Gordon, can we keep you for just a few more questions? That would be great. We have
I
so
love to
many
talk.
great, yeah, I know. We have so many great questions. We're going to keep Gordon here a little while longer. If I don't get to your question, there's no way I could get up to all of these, and they're so interesting and good. Perhaps you can ask Gordon after the meeting. Let me get to this one, though, because it's a little bit different. This person says, my wife is of Chinese heritage. Should we call it Communist Party of China instead of the Chinese Communist Party to avoid ethnic slur confusion?
The formal name of the Communist Party in English is the Communist Party of China. Most people call it the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. Whatever, you know, I'm not bothered by it. I really don't care, actually. I mean, it doesn't bother my sensitivities, and it shouldn't. And in the scheme of things, when China is trying to destroy our country, I think that what we call it is probably the least of our concerns.
Every now and then we'd like to be optimistic and look to the future. We're now looking at 2024, assuming there'll be a change in administration. What can the next U.S. president do to work with this, settle this? What are maybe name 3 attributes that the next president should have in regards to China?
I have an action plan, includes 7 items. Plus 3 more. Really what the president can do is, the most important thing is to understand that the challenge from China is existential. Remember, May of 2019, People's Daily, which is the most authoritative publication in China, declared a quote unquote people's war on us. And in August, last month, they came within a millimeter of calling us a quote unquote enemy. So the most important thing that the next president of the United States needs to do is essentially to understand the nature of the challenge, that this is not a competitor. This is not even an adversary. This is what the Chinese call us, an enemy. For 7, 8 years, we ignored Osama bin Laden. We even ignored him after he killed 6 people at the World Trade Center. We said, oh, he can't really mean that stuff. He can't hurt us, all the rest of it. And then, of course, we had that horrible day 20 years ago. We are ignoring what China is saying about us, just as we ignored Osama bin Laden. But unlike Osama bin Laden, China is actually powerful. And it can kill more than 2,933 people on a single day. So we Americans have got to stop being oblivious, or we're not going to have a country.
Gordon, would you please comment on the report about General Milley?
Okay, this is where, okay, just to summarize, twice, both before and after election last year, General Milley was so concerned about President Trump's state of mind that he actually called his Chinese counterpart to say, don't worry, we're not going to attack you. If we're going to attack you, I'll call you beforehand to let you know. Even if Milley's was correct in his assessment of Trump's state of mind, Milley could have accomplished what he sought to do, which is to maintain stability, in ways other than talking to China. And talking to China actually made the situation far worse for the United States, because what he did was Milley confirmed in Chinese minds that the US political system is falling apart. That inevitably has made the Chinese more aggressive, more bold. That's made them more dangerous to the United States. Now, Milley, I think, he said he's taken, apparently according to the Woodward book, Milley became concerned because of US intelligence community assessments that the Chinese felt we were going to attack them. I don't believe, the US intelligence community could very well have come to that assessment, but that assessment in my mind was not reasonable. It was not reasonable because we did not see during the times any unusual Chinese military movements, any Chinese preparations for war. We saw no changes in their propaganda, which they certainly would have been signaling if they felt that the US, in fact, was going to attack them. So on every level, what Milley did was wrong. He should resign. It's what he did was close to treason.
Close to treason. Maybe that should be his name of his memoir. Gordon, our audience is enjoying this. They're eating it up. They're wishing that you could present this information to the State Department. So I hope, or the CIA. So I hope,
in the current State Department, that is not going to happen.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what we can do. We have some connections in here. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to give the opportunity for you to greet our friends here and sign a few books. How can we stop corporations and even our generals and politicians from cooperating with the CCP? What can we do? What can the people in this room do today to support what you shared tonight?
That's a great question, which I don't have a great answer to. I mean, the most important thing is that there are more of us than they are of them. And in a democracy, votes count. Now, I will admit that those who want to maintain good relations with China because they make money from it or because they're oblivious or whatever reason, they're more powerful than we are in, person to person. But the point is that we've got the vote at the ballot box and we can organize. And, we have seen the American people actually be quite effective. So let's go to May 26th of this year. That was the day that Biden ordered the intelligence community to report back in 90 days on the origins of COVID-19. Now, this is a subject that Biden is not interested in. We know this because Biden spent 2 hours on the phone with Xi Jinping in February, and by Biden's own admission, did not raise this issue once. What happened on the morning of May 26th is that CNN, the night before, late night before, dropped a story that said that Anthony Blinken's State Department killed an investigation started by Secretary of State Pompeo into the origins of COVID-19. There was outrage across the United States, not just in Washington, but across the US. That outrage was so hot that Biden in the afternoon had to order the intelligence community review of COVID-19. I don't know, but I suspect that when Biden woke up on the morning of May 26th, he had no idea that he was going to order the IC to do this, but we forced him to. So it's hard to do, but we're going to have to do this. Just every issue that they do something which is horrible, we're going to have to go out and through the power of our purchases, through our voice on social media, through the votes at the ballot box, we can do this. Now, I don't know California politics very well, but my reading of this had been, the poll said that no on the recall was 58%, yes was only 39%. If by some miracle of God that Newsom is actually recalled, this will send a powerful message to Washington. It'll send a powerful message to China. This is the message that the American people sent in November 2016. So this is what we're going to have to do. Every election becomes important. And I mentioned November school board elections. If we can turn school boards on November, people in Washington are going to notice. People in China are going to notice. So this is what we can do. And I know this is not a great answer, but we can do this. And we're going to have to do this because if we don't do this, we're not going to have a country, ladies and gentlemen.